All right, I think we should go ahead and get started. So what we have on the agenda for today is that we're going to finish up our little unit on access, and then for that we're going to be covering the material that is in chapter 3, but we're not going to do chapter 3. So I want you to read the stuff that's in chapter 3, perhaps not right this very whole second, because we're going to be going over the material that's in chapter 3. So I want you to do the stuff that's in chapter 3, but, or rather I want you to read the stuff that's in chapter 3, but we're going to do something completely different. And something different that we're going to do is we're going to take the Our Students database that we did in Access Basics, and we're going to improve upon it using the stuff that we're going to using the stuff that's found in chapter 3. So that's kind of the plan for chapter 3. And then the other thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to start talking about PowerPoint and start the PowerPoint presentations unit, and to talk a little bit about the final project and what you'll need to do for the final project. To let you know that the sign-up sheet for the final project is up and ready for you to go in and sign up right this very whole second if you so desire. Every single one of you needs to do a presentation. It is super easy. It is super safe and very friendly, but you have to do it. I do recognize that most people would rather die than stand in front of the room and talk about things for a couple of minutes, but I am going to make it as simple and as straightforward and as non-painful as possible. The thing is, I will tell you right now what your grade will be. If you don't do the assignment, you will get 0 out of 50 points. And if you do stand up here and do it, then you will not get the 50 points. That is to say, you will get the 50 points. So the only possible way to not get the 50 points is if you don't do it. That is the only possible way that you will not get the 50 points, which is a huge chunk of the stuff that we're doing. All right. So what we need to do first is, again, we need to finish up talking about access. So in order to do that, the first thing that you want to do is you want to make sure that you've gone into your Canvas, and you want to go into assignments, and you want to go into the databases section. And in the databases section, the final part is the one that says MS Access Chapter 3, Lookup Fields, Split Forms, and Updating Records. And you want to click onto that. And in there is a thing that says, for this assignment, use the Our Students database we created in part 1. If you've misplaced it, or even if you haven't misplaced it, and you want to use the one that I have set up so that everything looks exactly the same, which is what I would recommend, click on here where it says for project 3, Our Students. And if you click onto that, it will then ask you to download it, or it'll automatically download it. And you want to save it. And then when you save it and we then open it, it will open up in Access. And the first thing that you need to do after you have opened it up in Access is you need to click on this button here that says Enable Content. So you click on Enable Content, and then if you want to double check that it has stuff in it, you could open up the table and you could see we have our table that we had set up in part 1. So that is, that's the first thing that you need to do on this. And then in order to do the stuff that we are going to do, the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to create what is known as a calculated field. And so right at the moment, what we have is we've got first names and we've got last names. But what we want to do is we want to create a new field that is going to be a full name. And in the full name, what we want is we want it to be the data that are in the first name field added to the data that are in the last name field. So the first name field is, Robert and Johnson, and the first name field is Robert and George and Sally and Jane and Fake, and the last name fields have Johnson and Smith and Student and Doe and Fakerson. And so what we want is we want to create a new field that would have Robert Johnson, George Smith, Sally Student, and so on. So in order to do this, in the book, the example that they have in the book is on pages 158 to 159. It's the part where it says to add a calculated field. And what they are doing is they are taking the total amount and they're calculating the total amount based on the amount paid and the current due added together. And what we are going to do is we are going to instead create a new field that is going to be the first name and the last name fields added together. So in order to do this, the first thing we want to do is we want to go into the design view, because it's in the design view that we create our fields. So on view, go down to design view. And then the field that we want to create is we want to create a new field that we are going to call full name. So we're going to call it the full name field. And in the full name, instead of choosing a short text or number or long text or currency or anything else that is there, we instead want to choose calculated. So we're going to go in and we're going to choose calculated. And when we do calculated, it's going to bring up this expression builder. And in the expression builder, we want to take the fields that already exist. And the fields that already exist are the ones that are in this category section here. And we want to add them to the expression builder. So if I put in, if I double click on first name, it pops up here, it says first name. If I double click onto last name, it puts up last name. And you'll notice that there's a little thing in the middle that says EXPR. EXPR means what is the expression that you want to use. And in text, really about the only thing you can do with text is add to it. There is a way to do multiplication, but generally it's just adding. And adding in text means that you want to take the text that's in field number 1, when you add it to field number 2, it concatenates or brings together the stuff that was in field 1 and the stuff that was in field 2. You may recall we did this in Excel. We played around with this a little bit in Excel to do this kind of thing as well. But in here, we want to do, we want to just put in a little plus sign. So we're going to say the first name field plus, and then the last name field. And when I click OK, it's going to then say that the first name field is calculated, and the expression is going to be first name plus and then last name. And first name and last name are both indicated with square brackets. And the square brackets tell you that this is the field. So anything that's in between the open and closed square brackets is the field that we are adding together. So in the expression, we have first name is the first name field, and then a plus, and then last name is the last name field. And if we do that, and we then view our data, so if I go in on view and I go to design view, or I'm in design view, I do a data sheet view, and I save my table, then I now have this new field over here that says Robert Johnson, George Smith, Sally Student, Jane Doe, Fake Fakerson. So that's not exactly what I want. What I'd rather have is a space between first name and last name. So in order to put in the space between first name and last name, I need to go back into my design view. I need to go back into my calculated area. I need to go into my expression and either manually type it in, or I could put in this 3 little dots, and I could click onto these 3 little dots, and I can, in the expression builder, I can add a space. Now I can't just add a space by just typing in a space. I have to put it inside of quotes so that it knows what I want to go in between it. So I need to say first name, and then a plus, and then a quote, and then a space, and then a quote, and then another plus. Because what I'm saying is I'm saying that I want this new full name field to be the first name field concatenated with a space concatenated with a last name, with the last name field. And so when I click OK now, and then I go back to the data sheet view, and I save my table, it now says Robert space Johnson, George space Smith, Sally space Student, Jane space Doe, Fake space Fakerson. And just to prove to you that you could do literally anything, I could go in on my design view. Don't do this, but I'm going to do it. And instead of it saying first name with a space, I will say super totally awesome space. And what this will do is this will now say Robert super totally awesome Johnson, George super totally awesome Smith, and so on. So it's not magical that it puts in the space. It's because I want there to be a space, and so I put in just the space. So I'm going to change that back to being just a space because I really just want it to be a space. So then the full name becomes what we recognize to be a full name. Questions? Yeah. Was that a space and a plus sign? Yeah, well, it's a plus sign, a space, sorry, a plus sign, a space, a open quote, a space, a closed quote, a space, and a plus. And then the last name field. So that the syntax is going to be, whatever the field name that you want, plus quote, space, quote, plus, and then the second field. So if this is field 1 and a space, field 2 would be what it would say. Maybe I'll make it slightly smaller so that it's all on one line. There you go. So field 1 would be the first name field, and field 2 would be the last name field. And what's great about this is that you can literally create, anything with this. So if you were creating, I don't know, name tags, and you want the name tags to say, hi, my name is blah, 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 then what you could do is you could do something like, I don't know, hello, my name is space, and then the field is the field is called, I think it's called first name, and then last name. And then if I wanted there to be like an exclamation point or something like that, then it would do that. Then what that would translate to is, if it's Mark and Branham, it would translate to, hello, my name is Mark Branham, exclamation point, something like that.
So between the plus, there's no space.
You can put in a space. You don't have to put in a space in between the pluses. I usually put space in there, not because the computer requires it, but because it makes it easier for humans to read. And in computing, I always tell people that, that you have to follow two rules. Rule number one, which must be followed, is that you have to make it so that the computer understands what you want. So you have to put in the correct syntax. You have to do it the way the computer expects it to be. The second part is that you should also make it so that it's easy for humans to understand. So an example of that is, why is this field name called first name and not F1? Well, because first name is a more meaningful, I want to say something other than the word name, a more meaningful identifier than F would be, or X. But as far as the computer is concerned, it could call it X and we could call this Y. As long as in Access, we called it X and Y. So in Access, I could, instead of saying the field name is first name, I could say the field name is X. And as long as I then, in my code down here for the expression, I said X, it would work. But X is not a very meaningful name to a human. First name is a more meaningful identifier to a human. And so that's why I would use, that's why I don't want to violate rule number 2. That make sense? Okay. Any questions about how I did the calculated field? So the other thing about calculated fields is that I think it's obvious that you can use calculated fields to calculate numerical stuff, like adding together, what are they doing? They're adding together amount paid and current due. I don't think it's as obvious that you can add together text. And that's one of the reasons why I prefer to use the text version, because you can use you can add together text. The other thing I would probably want to do is I'd probably want to change the description to say that this would be the full name of the student, automatically created, something like that. All right. So lookup fields. Lookup fields are used if you want to give your entry person a series of choices that they can pick to enter in the data for a particular field. So, for example,
Okay, I found this on the web. Series.
I must have said the word series, and my phone thought I said SIRI. Yes. Anyway, so what you use the lookup field for again is to set up a set of items from which a user can pick either only one of them or several of them. Hopefully my phone won't mistake that as something else. Yes, question.
I'm sorry, when I saved that one, it is saved as a full name Robert Johnson and Joe Smith. It's not the same as you. Can you come back from that one? I click it on table, I have just one table.
I only have one table.
Yeah, but the first time you
I have first name, I have student ID, first name, last name, email address, and now full name, which is what we just created.
but the first what was the first?
Student ID.
No, the first document that you
No,
have.
because you had it on the other, you know, when you click on.
Because there are two different views. There's the design view and the datasheet view. And so you need to go into the design view to design it, and you need to go to the datasheet view in order to enter in the data
Okay.
or to view the data.
Okay, got it, thank you.
Yeah, so again, the datasheet view is the view that you want to be in anytime that you are entering in your data or are viewing your data. And then the design view is when you are creating the data. Or not creating the data, rather, but creating the structure. So creating what the fields are and how those fields are put together. All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a student status field. And for the student status, I don't want users to just type in whatever they want it to be. I want to give them the choices that they are going to do. So to do that, I'm again in my student information table. I'm in the design view. And in the design view, the field name that I'm going to do is student status. And for this, I'm doing a lookup field. And in order to do a lookup field, you click onto the drop-down menu and you go down to where it says Lookup Wizard. And when you do and again, in your book, they're talking about this on pages 154 to 157. And they're doing it, creating a lookup field for the customer type, but we're doing it based on the type of students. And so when you're creating it, you can either take the data from another table that you've created. You can take the data and type them in yourself, which is what I'm going to do. I'm just going to type in the data myself. So I'm going to type in the data, the values that I want. And the values that I want are, and this is on your paper, I want freshman, and then I want sophomore, and then junior, and then senior, and then master's student, and then PhD, and then other. So those are the field choices that are the lookup choices that I want to have. I only want one column, so I'm just putting it all in one column. If I had wanted to have people choose from like 2 or 3 columns, then I would put in 2 or 3 columns, and I would put in whatever it is that I want that I'd want it to be. And when I do that and I click on to next, it's going to ask me what do I want to call what label do I want for the lookup field? So again, I want it to be a student's student status. And here's where you need to make a decision. And you have two decisions that you need to make. Decision number one is, do you want to limit entries to the choices given? I would argue in this case, yes. You don't want people to be able to type over them. The downside of doing that is that you are saying you only can choose these choices. That's what this is saying. And then the second thing is, do you want to allow multiple values? So if you allow multiple values, it means that people can choose that they want to be both sophomores and PhD students at the same time. Probably not actually something that can happen, although I do know that oftentimes at university you can have you can be both an undergraduate and a master's student at the same time. They generally call that coterminal students. So it's conceivable that you might want to allow multiple values to be chosen in this case. I'm not going to, but if you want to, it's totally fine. And then I click on to finish. And again, in the description for it, I would say something like the student status. And then maybe say what they are: freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, master's, PhD, something like that. And so now if I view this and I save my table, there's this new field over here that says student status. And if I click onto it, there's a little drop-down menu. And they pick whichever one it is that I'd want to pick. So I could pick, I don't care, whatever it is that I want it to be.
Save this one?
Yes.
The student? Yes. Then we go to the data sheet.
You want to go to the data sheet.
Data sheet?
Yeah, to actually view it. And then that should create a drop-down menu for the student status. If you chose multiple, it will be a checkbox. There will be a little drop-down menu with a checkbox next to the ones.
We cannot get that sophomore and first PhD.
You should be able to. If you click onto it and you click onto the drop-down, you should be able to choose.
You should click on the student status.
Mm-hmm.
Then
So go into one of the fields and pick one of them and click onto the drop-down menu. It should pop up. It doesn't matter which one you pick. So like I said, on step number 2, update each record with one of the student status choices. Doesn't matter which one you pick. By the way, if you wanted to, let's say that after a while you realize that you forgot to add a field, a choice rather, and you wanted to add another choice. If I go back to my design and I go back to my student status, down here, where it's in the field properties, where it says lookup, in the lookup, in raw source, there is the list, and it's separated by semicolon. So each choice is separated by semicolon. So if you decided that you wanted to change, I don't know, freshman to being first year, I don't know, something like that, then you could do that by going in and changing it in the raw source. It's also why in the required steps that I typed it out the way that I typed it out, because that's how it would show up. The other thing is that the display control is a combo box, which means a drop-down menu. You could do a list box or a text box. I don't recommend that you do that because they're harder to read, but you could. The source again is the value list that I created. If you're taking it from a table, then you would choose what the table is. If you're taking it from a field list, you have to specify which field it's coming from. But in this case, we're taking it from this value list. The other thing is, initially I said limit to the list. If I decided later on that I don't want to limit it to just the list, I could change that flag from being yes to no, and then it would allow people to overwrite what I wrote. And if I allow multiple values, right at the moment I said no, but again, I could change that to say yes, and then it would show up as multiple choices when people selected multiple choices. Questions about lookup field? Is this making sense? Okay, all right. The next thing then we want to do is pretty simple. So we're going to go back to the table view. And what we're going to do is we are going to create what's called a split form. And what a split form does is a split form allows you to see both the table and a form at the same time. Here's the problem. You can't have two instances of a table open at the same time, otherwise it causes conflicts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close my table so that there's nothing there. Well, I mean, there's still tables over here, but there's nothing here. And then I'm going to click on to create. And when I create, I'm going to go over to forms, and in forms, I'm going to click on to more forms. And in more forms, I'm going to click on to split form. Split form. And when I do split form, it creates the table on the top, the form on the top, and the table at the bottom. And if I wanted to change the form layout, I could change the form layout, but I'm fine with keeping the form layout exactly as it is. So if I go on to view, right at the moment I'm in the design view, or the layout view rather. If I go instead to the form view, I have the form here. And down here I've got the table. And I could go by looking at the table at the same time that I'm looking at the form. And if I save this, I want to save this as the split form.
Could you save it from there? Save as?
If you do save as, you want to make sure that you do save as and save object as. You want to save it as an object because it's an object.
You can see all must be closed.
Right, that's why I said you want to close your table before you do it, because otherwise it's going to cause conflict. And so now what I have is I've got my split form, and what the split form has is it's got the table at the top, I mean the table at the bottom and the form at the top.
After that, save. First of all, close it and then save again.
Yeah. And again, in your book, they talk about this on pages 141 and 142. I guess really 143 as well. And then the next thing that we want to do on this is we want to update Sally's student's record by changing her email address. So this is on pages 143 to 145, and so to search, it's found over here when you're on home and you're in either the table view or the form view. You can click on to find, or if you want to replace, you can click on to replace. Replace just opens up find and replace and goes to the replace tab. The find tab, the find button takes you to the find tab. Otherwise, it's the same thing. And it allows you to search for things. Now, one of the problems with this is that, let's say I wanted to search for Sally students' email address and to change it. So Sally student's email address is sally.student@fake.com. So if I'm trying to replace this, I might go on and I might say in find what, I might say sally.student@fake.com, and I want to replace it with sally.student@stu.sjcc.edu, because she's taking my class and she now has a Sally student email address. However, if I try to replace this or even find it, it says Microsoft Access finished searching the records. The search item was not found. Why? Well, that's because look in. The look in says only look in the current field. Well, the current field is Jane Doe. And the current the current record is Jane Doe. And the current field was the first name field. So I don't want to say current field. I want to say current document. And on the match, I would recommend saying match any part of the field, because I'm actually looking for specific data inside of the record. And I don't know why this isn't a default setting in Access, but it's not. By default, it only will search the current field that you're in the current record that you're in, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me, because that, you know, defeats kind of the whole point of searching. So I need to change that. And if I change that, now I could do find next and it will find it. And then I can say replace it. I'll say, are you sure? You're not able to undo. I want to say yes. And that will then change Sally Student from Sally Student at fake.com to Sally Student at stu.sjcc.edu. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that in the table view, it's changed. But it doesn't change immediately in the form view until I click out of it and click back into it. or until I refresh my refresh all. Because again, you have to do refresh all in order for Access to really find all of your stuff. Yes. Right, so that's probably, again, because you need to make sure that when you're saying look in, that you choose look in current document instead of current field.
No, I'm in current document and then current field.
Okay, so then the thing to check is to make sure that you didn't have a typo, because that could also be the case.
There's no current document in our box.
If I do fake Fakerson and I search for fake Fakerson and I click on to find next, it finds fake Fakerson.
Oh, it was on replace.
Aha. Okay. And then to do replace, you want to then click on to replace all or replace the specific thing if there's something you want to replace.
Sorry, we go to the current document, then we replace it.
Yeah, you want to replace and change Sally Students' email address.
I do not have to replace option here. It says just find.
So when you do find, you should be able to then click onto the replace.
It's doing the same thing.
It's saying that that you can't replace it.
Microsoft Access finished searching, the search item was not found.
Huh. All right, I'll come and take a look at it in a moment because we're almost done. We'll come back to that and see if I can figure out what's going on your specific one. So the last thing that I want to show you how to do is to create validation rules for really anything, but in this case, I want to do the validation rule for an email address. So they talk about validation rules on pages 162 to 168. And basically what validation rules do is they allow you to make sure that the person entering in the data only enters in valid data. And so what you have to do in creating the validation rules, you have to define what is valid data. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to, so I'm going to close my split table and go back in, or my split form and go back into my table. And in my table, I'm going to go into my design view. And in the design view, I want to go into the email address field. And in the email address field, there are a couple of things. Thing number one that I want to do is you'll notice that in field properties, so down here in the field properties area, in field properties, there is a choice that says required. There's a choice on here that says required. And by default, the required is always set to no. If I want to make it required, I need to change that to say yes. So if I change that to say yes, and then I go back to my view, and I design my have my table. If I try to go in and say delete fake Fakerson's email address, so I try to delete it altogether, and I go to the next field, and I save it. It's going to allow me to do it because I had set that up before and made it something that was allowed. But if I create a new field, so if I put fake Fakerson back in, if I create a new record, it should not allow me to do it without an email address. It says you must enter a value in the email address field. So it won't let me put in Mark Branham without an email address field. So I have to put something in there. So I just put in Mark. The problem though is Mark is not a valid email address. So I want not only that you have to have an email address, but I want it to be an actual email address. So for that, I am going to enforce that it must be an actual email address. And to do that, I am going to do that in what's called the validation rule. So in validation rule, I am going to put in the rule that requires it to be an email address. And the way I am going to do that is exactly what I said right here. Is null or like, and then this line of code. So let me tell you what this actually means. So is null means that it's empty. So there's nothing there. That's what is null means. Like actually means it has to look like this. It doesn't mean it's similar to, it means it has to look like this. That's what that means. And in computers, there is a concept known as regular expressions. And regular expressions have a lot of rules in them, but a star means 0 or more characters. A question mark means at least 1 character and only 1 character. Really, it just means 1 character. So, but it's not 0 or 1, it's 1. So what this means is that before the @ symbol, there must be at least 1 item, and there can be more than 1 item. There can be 0 or more plus 1, and then an @ symbol. And then after the @ symbol, there must be at least 1, but there can be more, followed by a period, followed by at least 1, but there can be more after the period. So what that means is that, you know, mark.branham@sjcc.edu is going to be valid because this, so this would be the star. This part right here would be the star. M would be the question mark. The @ symbol is the @ symbol. The S is the question mark. And then the JCC is the star. And then a period is the period. And then the E is the question mark. And then the DU is the star.
Is there a space between the star and the period?
Is there a space between the star and the period? No, because there can't be a space between the star and, if I wanted there to be a space between there, I would put in a space. And if I put in a space, it would require it to have a space. But then that wouldn't be a valid email address, because valid email addresses are always at least 1 letter, followed by an @ symbol, followed by at least 1 letter, followed by a period, followed by at least 1 letter. That's how email addresses are written. Now there could be more. You could have lots more, and you could have lots more, and you could have lots more, but there has to be at least that. And so that's what this expression actually means. This expression means 0 or more characters, followed by at least 1 character, well, 1 character, followed by the @ symbol, followed by 1 character, followed by 0 or more, followed by a period, followed by 1, followed by 0 or more. Now, there are other things that you could put in. You could put in, there's like number signs where it could be, you could make it be, that has to be a number. You could, there's other things that you can put in where it has to be a specific, like it has to be between A and Z, or it has to be between 1 and 5. I mean, there's lots more stuff that you could do. And if you want to learn all of the stuff that you could do, Google regular expression. Or come and see me afterwards and I'll tell you more. But that's what this is. Now, do I like actually typing that in? Of course not. That's why I copy and paste it. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to go back to my, that's why I put it in here, so you copy and paste it. And then I am going to go into my access. And in the validation rule, I'm going to paste that in. So now that I've done that, if I view this and I save it, and I say yes, and I create a new record, and we call this Bob Smith, and I say Bob Smith doesn't have one, it says you must enter a value in there, and I say, okay, Bob, it says 1 or 4 values are prohibited in this validation rule. All right, Bob at, nope, doesn't like that. Bob at Bob, nope. Bob at Bob dot, nope. Bob at dot Bob name, it says that's okay. Now the problem though is that the error message is not very readable. The error message says 1 or more values are prohibited by the validation rule, is null or like blah, 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 set for student information table email address, enter a value that the expression for this field can accept. I mean, technically that's accurate, but that's not very readable. So I want to make it readable. Changes you can make, because it would create, oh, do I have 2 things? Do I have another? Why is it saying that? Value. Change. Oh, because I have 2 zeros. That's why. I forgot to give it a new number. So we'll do 6. There we go. Because student ID, I had 2 zeros. All right. So I want to change what the validation text says. So I've written out a pretty good validation text, and I'm going to copy and paste that. So it's going to say email addresses must be in the form of username at organization.domain, for example, student at sjcc.edu. So when I do that and I save my table and I try to put in an invalid thing, it now says email addresses must be in the form of username at organization, for example, student at sjcc.edu, which is a much more readable and understandable error message than the error message that it was throwing before. So Bob at bob.name. And Bob is going to be, I don't know, will be a master's student. questions? So the final thing that I need to do is this file is called for project 3 our students. So I need to close out of my table and save it as a new database because I want to rename it. And I want to save it as Brianna Mark, updated students. And I'm going to say, yes, I want to replace it because I've done this before. And now that I've done that, I can then go in and submit my assignment. Because that is Access Chapter 3. Just like it says on the paper, you want to do it last name, first name, updated students,
That's not all.
your last name, first name. All right, so like I said, the next thing that we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the next unit, which is PowerPoint and presentations. But I think what we'll do right now is we'll take an extended break. And during that time, I'll help anybody that needs any help to get up to this point. But it's what, 7:35? Why don't we reconvene at about 8:05, so in about a half an hour. And we'll talk about PowerPoint and presentations, and I will talk about the biggest mistakes that people make in PowerPoint and how to avoid them and all of that kind of good stuff. So that's the plan for what we will do when we reconvene. Any global questions other than why is it not working on my screen? All right. So, like I said, let's go ahead and take a little break.